Cool. Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming to this talk. It's called Lean Learning Applied UX Research. Before I tell you what exactly we're getting into, I'm going to give you a little background on where I came from, and what you see here is one of the most rigorous and amazing research reports ever delivered to an organization. Took like a month to put this thing together. It was typeset in LaTeX. Nobody read it and nothing happened. And then I spent the next 7 years trying to figure out how to make research actually work. And so that's sort of the spirit that this talk is coming from. Is there are things that we would like to learn and we need to learn, but there are also conditions in which we do that learning that are really important in organizations, or we're not going to get anything done. So a quick intro. We're going to try to convince you that UX research is valuable, practical, and tractable. We'll have 3 parts to this talk. First, some maybe more like theoretical models and definitions around what does it mean to talk about a user experience, what does it mean to do applied research, what does it mean to go lean. Then we'll look at the structure of how you might do a small little research spike in this lean style. And finally, I'll give you 2 kind of real life stories about how we make it work. So just some background on me. I was born over on the right and then started working my way from Michigan to Ohio to Pennsylvania to Virginia. Went over to San Francisco for work for a while and spent 8 years in Silicon Valley out there, where I sort of like really learned the ropes, and recently came over here to sort of slow things down. And from a professional trajectory, that looked a little more like school and then very exciting work with the database, federal government contract. It was the best. And then I started as a designer at this company called Location Labs, and eventually worked my way to being the researcher. And at 5 different companies out in California, was the first person establishing a research program. So a lot of the lessons that I've learned are not coming from a formal place of mentorship, but trying and failing to make it work, which it's a great way to learn, but it's not the most exciting when you're in it right there. And then recently now, I'm at Dave's research company over on the right here, where I'm Employee of the Month. Okay, so let's talk about what specifically we're going to get into with the agenda. I sort of mentioned it already. The first thing we're going to do is a little bit theoretical, so I'm going to walk you through some models of these ideas: user experience, applied research, and lean. And yeah, let's get right into it. This is a new clicker, and it's kind of working. Okay, model number 1. This looks a tiny bit daunting, and I'm going to walk you through it really quick, but this is a user experience. Got it? Great. When we talk about working with the user experience and what goes into that, there's actually a lot, and I think what people think about is this core little piece right here. There is a user somewhere on that side, and there's our thing somewhere on this side. And in the parlance of service design or interaction design, you have either an interface or a touch point. You have the user over there, and there's some magical middle where they meet, and we have experiences. That's easy, but there's a little bit more. If you peel one layer deeper, there's actually some things going on behind the scenes that we don't have immediate access to. So our users have goals, they're doing activities, and they have motivations. And this is really important for us to know, because we can understand their behavior in the context of working with our apps, or we can understand what they're really trying to do and explain their behavior and predict what that behavior might be. On our side, on the business side on the left here, we also have this sort of service structure, this information environment. I know if you've ever gone to an airline counter and you're working with the person and then they say, sorry, the system won't let me do that. This is what we're talking about, is the system. And there's a lot to be said about it, but just being aware that it's another piece that contributes to the user experience, even though we're not dealing with it, is important to being able to work with this stuff. A final layer is that way over there, behind our user, behind their motivations and their goals, they're coming from a place where they're a part of a community, there's a larger society, and they've got a physical environment. We'll get into that a little bit further and down the road. And then on our side, on the business side here, we also have sort of like our organizational and business context. The real motivation for why the service exists and for why the touch point is the way that it is comes from what we're trying to do strategically, the money that we have, the structure, and all the different lines of business units that we have. So when we talk about user experience, right now, I think it's very easy to characterize it as the middle, but as we get into user experience research, it's important to know how far we need to go out on the edges. And there's a final wrinkle. When a user comes to use your product, they have a model of how this all works. This is people call it a mental model. We call it expectations. It's hard to see in this picture, but they essentially have in their brain that they don't know a little picture of how all of your stuff works. On our side, we have a little picture of everything about them. These are things that aren't explicit, they're very implicit, but you get bad user experiences when the two don't match. If a person comes to use your app or your service, and the way that they think it works is not how it works, they're going to have a bad time. And if the way that you've designed your app or your service doesn't fit the way that the person lives in the world, they're going to have a bad time. So this is sort of the framework we'll use for describing what a user experience is. And as we talk about research, today we're going to talk about lean research, which means we are a little bit closer to the middle. We're going to talk about the users. We're going to talk a little bit about their goals. We're not going to go terribly far into the environment. But I wanted you to have a backdrop that this is all going to be setting on. So that's the easy part. There is the user experience. And hopefully this model now is a little less daunting to look at and see what's going on. Okay. Does anyone know these two people?
Not personally.
Very good. These, essentially they're average people. Their names are Joe and Josephine, and a famous industrial designer named Henry Dreyfuss worked, and actually I think his book is called The Measure of Man and Woman, to create these models. He was designing trains, thermostats. The famous first round thermostat from Honeywell was what Henry Dreyfuss designed. And to design those types of physical products, you kind of need to know people's physical dimensions. That doesn't work for us. And so when we think about what we're looking to do, I think this clicker just stopped, so I'm sorry, but I'll walk over here to click some slides. When we deal with digital products and services and we're working with people's activities, we need to understand what they're trying to do and how they're going to act in real-world context. So if you think if you want someone to use your product or service well, it's not going to help you to know how tall they are. That's sort of the full thesis here of that little bit. For user experience, it's different. Now we'll talk about doing research in the user experience, and there's sort of a false dichotomy that's come up quite a bit that I have found, especially in the Silicon Valley ethos when companies talk about being data-driven. Maybe you haven't encountered this as much, but there's this idea of there's like weak, soft data, and then there's real hard data. There's that show me the numbers attitude. And I'm not sure if you've encountered this, but I want to, let's say we'll get ahead of it. Qualitative is not weak data, and quantitative is not hard data that's strong. There's actually a weak and a strong side for each of these. So quantitative work, again, that's analytics, that's data science, that's A/B testing. The weak side of that is just estimating. Like, we don't know how many people are clicking this CTA. We don't know how many people actually converted on version A or version B. We don't have a good model that's going to predict how people will act. The hard side is just the opposite of that. We have deep analytics, we have a well-instrumented product, we have some predictive models that we're using to actually understand how people are going to act. It works the same way with qualitative data, except instead of estimates, it's guesses, and instead of having analytics and models, we have scenarios. We describe situations in which people use our products, and we have predictive models, and those predictive models come from understanding people's goals. We deeply understand those goals, and we understand the scenarios they're going to be in. We can start to play through what it looks like when a person engages in a user experience. So, what we're talking about, what we're getting to, is user experience research that lives right here. Although we won't talk today deeply about the scenarios and models, because that's not as much on the lean side. It's call it like a deeper strategic piece of it all. So when we talk about this stuff, when we look at this stuff, behavior is what's really important, and I'll hit on this a few times. That's one of the big takeaways about doing user experience research. You can't trust what people say. People don't say things that are true about how they act. If I ask you, how often do you go to the gym? It's probably not the truth, even if it's what you think is the truth, because it's what you want to be. Self-report is really hard. We get a little closer if I say, how many times did you go to the gym in the last week? Concrete facts about recent behavior are really good. So we want to watch what people do or have done recently, and we use that to extrapolate why, to start building our understanding of how they engage with the user experience. Okay, we've got user experience done. We've got user experience research roughly covered. We're going to talk a little bit about what it means for it to be applied, which is a really, really important part of doing research, especially in an organizational context. So if you've seen any of these words, they sound great. If people are talking about doing research or learning a lot or talking to users, it seems like what we should be doing, right? We're user experience people. But it's really bad because it means that we don't know what we're looking for. So the point of applied research is that we have goals and we have objectives. They're very clear things that we're trying to do as people working in organizations building out user experiences. We want to know what we're trying to do. We want to know what we're going to see in the world. With that, it means that what type of language we should be looking for when we're working with people is this. It's we need to learn X so we can decide how to act on Y. That's all there is to applied research. There is a very wonderful branch of academic research that's the pure production of knowledge, and it's not something that's going to help us move forward in a user experience organization. I'll give you, this one's a little messier, but if you ignore the arrows and just think, like, what does that really mean? What is the process of doing research? I like to break it out into 6 steps. Very shortly, it's like we've got to figure out what we need to know. We've got to figure out how we're going to get that answer. We're going to get that answer. And so I'm in the first half now. And getting that answer, like doing our research and executing it, that's just watching people do stuff or interviewing them about behavior. Then we have to figure out what we saw. Did we get good data? Was it reasonable? Is it going to answer our question? We make sense of it with our team, and then hopefully something actually happens. So this is, again, just research in the applied lens. And the way that you can gut check questions that you're asking or research that you're doing before you actually engage in it is ask people this question. How will the answer to this question change what we're going to do? There have been many projects where I didn't ask that at first. We went out, we did some research, we found that something didn't work right or was not what people expected, but there wasn't time in our development schedule or our product manager just didn't care. And so I may as well not have done any of that research. And that's kind of the real thrust of applied research is we're doing it so that we can do things better and differently. And if we're not going to change how we act, there's no point in doing this research. All right, and the final layer of our building up concepts is the idea of lean. You probably heard about it from Lean Startup, and what it does for our context is it's really just changing the language that we're using to talk about our research questions and our answers. We're going to start reframing it into this idea of there are assumptions and there are risks. So we have our objectives, and we have potentially like a solution. We think we know how we're going to answer this problem. We think we know what design is going to work or what features we can build to support our goals. Those are hypotheses, and there are risks in the way. Risks are the things that might happen that could prevent us from reaching our goal if we act on this hypothesis. So, diving one step deeper there are 4 types of risks we can talk about. We really care about the 4th, but I wanted to illustrate each of them. Policy risk. If you remember Groove Shark, RIP, it was great. And they missed some of the legal framework around what they were doing, and then they have agreed to cease their operations immediately and hand over everything. That sucks. Technology risk. This was a recent SpaceX launch. Something went wrong with the launch. Space is hard. This is a kind of risk that you need to watch out for, and especially for most of you who I assume are developers, the kind of risks that you're attuned to. It's not what we're going to talk about today. It's the type of things that you can work with, like small proof of concepts and technical spikes to make sure and evaluate the type of things you would like to build are actually feasible. There's also just like business and market risk. Maybe you have an idea and people like it and they love to pay $10 an hour to get their house cleaned. And then you're a startup and you get $40 million, and once you blow through all that, there's nothing left and then you have to shut down. Well, again, another type of risk that we're not talking about today, but when we think about these risks, all of these companies had goals and objectives. They had things they were trying to do, and some risk was in the way that they did not appropriately mitigate. Finally, there's product risk. And this one we're going to go one step further down into because there are kind of 4 layers to the product risk. And if you think about this model, each of these corresponds a little bit to some area of that user experience. So the first is that people don't see any benefit. It just doesn't fit into their lives at all. You've got a great idea for an app. that works for you. Nobody else in the world wants it. That's a real product risk. People won't take the time to learn to use it. So there is some cost-benefit analysis that people take, and especially when we look at more complex software, enterprise software, this is something that can be really hard, and also an interesting angle if users are mandated to use your software by corporate buyers and their enterprise customers. We won't talk about that too much, but there's an interesting balance there, because maybe people are mandated to use it and they won't take the time to learn how to use it, and then they do poorly at their job. It makes your software look bad and everything sucks. Third type, people are confused or frustrated and can't use it, and this takes us back closer to the point of experience. This is really like, do they understand what's going on? Does their model match what we've built? And finally, all the way back out on the far side of the user experience model, we are all people living in a real world with communities and environments. Maybe we have this thing and it seems great, but it's not socially acceptable, or it doesn't fit into our environmental infrastructure. Our community looks down on it. We can't use it. These are the types of things that when we talk about doing lean user experience research, we're looking out for. We're trying to figure out how we can address and mitigate. So, I do have one example for this one. It's maybe my favorite. They thought Segway was going to hit 1 billion in sales as fast as any company in history. Does anyone know what happened? They didn't. And to go back and just sort of give you an example, a reason why is I think people understood how to use it. I think people saw the benefit. The cost was high. However, there's a whole infrastructure around transportation. If you think about people who use bikes, there are bike lanes. There are easy places to put in garages. There's bike racks with locks all over. You can carry them upstairs. This thing is like, who knows, 80 pounds, 150 pounds? It doesn't work on sidewalks well with people. You get laughed at if you use it in a bike lane. You just look like an idiot. Like, it's not great. Like, maybe if you're a cop or you're taking a tour, it's fine. But it's this type of risk that we want to start to learn how to see and evaluate, and ask the question, is this something that we can learn about? Is this something we can do research to mitigate? So there, I think, if we wrap up this whole lean mindset and just sort of reframe that idea of doing applied research, we have an objective, we have a hypothesis about how it's going to answer it. One way we could test that hypothesis is by spending years and $100 million of venture funding to build our Segway. Like, another way is maybe we give someone a thing that is Segway sized and just ask them to carry it around with them and see where they put it, see where they use it on a sidewalk. So if we see these risks, then we can ask, how do we validate the hypothesis or mitigate the risk? That's our lean mindset for user research. And let's see, if I summarize everything that I just told you about user experience, applied research, and lean research, it's essentially, we want to identify those risky assumptions about people's activity and behavior, about how they're going to use our thing, and figure out what to learn. We've got to be able to see the behavior in context, because they probably showed people the Segway and everyone was like, yeah, that thing's great. This has happened to tons of apps where you see it, you think it's a good idea, you show it to people, and you just ask them, what do you think? Do you like it? Would you use it? These hypotheticals don't give us the right type of data. That's not facts. We make sense of what we saw, we figure out why did they act the way that they did, and we figure out what it means for us, and we move on. Okay. We're all right on time. Are there any questions about that base layer before we move into the next piece? I'm happy to take right now, or we'll just cruise.
Actually, I have one question. On the company side, you have a service and sorry.
Yeah.
Are you including business processes in that piece as well?
Ooh, I should be better at paging through this thing. So yeah, it's in the far, let's see, the service and
Information environment.
between these two, yes, business processes. Depending on the size of your business and how many business units there are, it really affects what's going on. Because if there are a ton of business units on the far left, it means that you actually have a really segmented service and information environment. And that is where you get some of those airline problems where the person at the counter says, sorry, I just can't do that, even though it seems like the simplest thing in the world to us on the other side who have a very implicit assumption about how it should work that doesn't match reality. Okay, I'll go on, and now it's still a little abstract. We're gonna look at what does research look like when we do it. And again, I'll give you a model. Here it is, the answer to how to do research. There are 3 parts here, and I will take you into each of them. There's sort of a kickoff and a planning, there's doing the work, and there's making sense of what we saw. So when you and your team have a goal, and you have some idea of how you're going to work with it, you think this product's going to work, you want to release this thing, you can have a meeting and ask, what are the risks that we see? What are the assumptions we're making about what's going to happen in the world, and what might stop us from achieving those ends? That's it. That's sort of like part 1. Then this is where the research comes in, and where a researcher or research practitioner will be especially helpful at helping you figure out what do we need to see to actually identify whether or not our hypothesis is valid or this risk is something we need to design around if we need to change it. I'm not going to go too deeply into that, but we'll save time for Q&A, and if you've got specifics, we can absolutely talk about it. So you conduct these research sessions, you run every session according to a plan. There's a really interesting part about saving time for a debrief, and I'll show you what that looks like within each session. And then after all the sessions, you basically wrap them all up and you say, what did we see? Did we learn what we needed to? What do we do next? So that's really high-level structure. And just to walk you through it again, you start with the kickoff and planning meeting, and sometimes this can be really formal, especially if you're in a longer cycle development process. Maybe you really do need to figure out what are all the implicit assumptions? What does everyone think we're doing? It means building alignment around what you're actually trying to do, whereas in smaller startups, it's really apparent. It's like, this is the thing we're trying to do, this is what we're building, here are the designs, or here's the prototype. Maybe it's even been engineered. What's going to go wrong before we release it? So you do that, and then I mentioned that there's this like session. And so I'll tell you a little bit about what it looks like. When you know what the question is and you know what you need to see, you do 2 things. You find the right people, you learn about who they are, you have them use your thing, and then you're done. But for each one of those things, that's our gray bubble. It's like a user interview session. For every single one, maybe one of the most important things you can do is have this green bubble, which is a team top-line debrief. And it's where you start to make sense of what you saw and begin to have a team judgment on what that is. And so I usually use this question, some form of it, to really provoke people to try and just pull what's meaningful. But we learned about this person, we saw them using our product, or using a prototype of our product. Let's say we had to drop this project for a month and we go back to it. What do we want to remember? What did we see? What are the things that are already wrong with our product? Or like, what questions did it raise that might change how we do this session, even with the next user? So you go through and you've kicked it off. You've got 5 of these things done. A lot of questions come up about numbers and statistical significance. The number of these things depends on how many populations of users may be using your prototype. So if you have a large consumer base and you think there are a few distinct patterns of behavior, you're going to want to try and segment it out so that you see 3 to 5 people of each of these different groups. And we're not talking about demographics. We're not talking about like men versus women necessarily, or old people. We're talking about patterns in how people think and how they act. So it may be people, if you're an online merchant, it may be people who are very frugal and who plan, and then they decide to purchase, or it may be people who are on-the-spot buyers, and they see something, they buy it. Maybe like this is the way that we segment our group, and we say, how do we find the right types of people so that we can understand the behavior coming from both of them? And then, if you look, this diagram's not exactly good, but we have notes from each of these sessions. Sometimes we video record, but you create a real burden of data. If you interview users, you transcribe everything, you video record everything. It's like this weight sitting on top of you, and you have to go back and debrief through it. You really have to sift through it, which is why we do those little short meetings right after. Because then what you can do is you can roll up each of those meetings and have one consolidated end debrief meeting and use that to really make your judgment. This is an artifact of doing things lean. If we're taking a longer cycle research approach and we're doing more strategic research, we do go back into that data, we synthesize it more deeply. But when we're going lean, we're trying to target pretty specific questions so that we can take the luxury of just skimming off all of our top-line debrief meetings into one. And what it can look like is this thing that designers love to do and researchers love to do. And you basically take, for every note that you made from your top-line debriefs, you write them on a sticky note. Everybody has a pile of sticky notes. They come up to the board, someone puts one sticky note on the board, and everybody looks at their sticky notes and says, do I have anything that's like that or maybe similar to that? you start adding these in and you form groups. So this is you call it like affinity mapping is the name of the technique. And if you want to describe the process, it's a informal bottoms-up synthesis process. It's taking all of the little data points that we've seen and we think are important and figuring out what the major clusters and groupings are. Then we circle each of those things and we decide how to act on it. So some cases, in this case I'll just show you like middle zone, people didn't see the search. It was something that was just passed over lightly in each session, but after 5 sessions you realize, oh, nobody saw the search bar when they were first looking for it. Here's something we can act on, here's something we can do. So this is just how this type of bottoms-up technique helps you make sense of disparate data. And if you want to look at if words are better than pictures for you, you crawl all the notes, you pull the top line, bite them onto sticky notes. Affinity mapping is one at a time. This is all right, well, we'll go, and if it gets really frustrating, we'll just like go outside and I'll show you my laptop. So we do the affinity mapping process, one at a time, out loud, group it as you see fit. Don't name a group until it's well formed. If you name a group before it's well formed, you've put a concept down there and maybe something that could be related, someone's not going to put there anymore, or they're going to jump to some conclusions. Rearrange, and then you really just walk through each of these groups. You got all these circled sticky note areas, and you say, okay, we saw this. Does this mean anything to us? Is there anything we need to do about it? We saw this. Does it mean anything to us? Does it answer our question? Does it help mitigate the risk? And then you're done. So that is the structure of the research spike. I know it's still pretty abstract. We're going to get slightly more concrete in just a moment. But the summary of this part is that you need to have some team buy-in on the question, and that's where you do this kickoff meeting. If your team doesn't agree that the question is important, they are not going to care what the answer is. And that has happened to me a number of times where I see something important, and I go out and I find the answer, and I say, guys, look at this thing that we learned about our users and our product that doesn't work. And everyone says, well, that's not a problem that we're worrying about. You probably shouldn't have done that. So don't do that. Make sure that you identify the right artifact and interview to get what you need. We'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in the next examples. Your team should be in all these sessions where you interview your users and debrief right after, and then you consolidate it all and do affinity mapping. All right. Any progress on the beeping? All right. Hey. I will close that session. And we'll give like 20 seconds, see if we can make an advance in this situation before diving into 2 little stories.
Can I ask a question? Are you going to make these slides available? They're fantastic.
I'm going to turn these slides into high fidelity models that are actually drawn out, but they will be publicly available on my website. I have a link to the resources at the end. Hey! Great question. Thank you. We've solved the beeping. Okay, so I'll tell you 2 stories. They're pretty high level. Again, we talked a little bit about what the user experience looks like, what it means to do research into there, and how to be lean about it. We've seen the structure of how you lay it out, but it is probably still really fuzzy because you don't have examples or scenarios. I'm going to give you 2. The first one's a really short spike. The second one is a longer lean process. And we're not going to get into the details of how do you actually interview users or develop the test plan. There are a number of great resources out there, and I think if I tried to teach that to you right now, it just wouldn't work and we'd lose everything. So let's go into this. Add to order. This is small story number 1. You are a research-minded person at a grocery delivery company. Currently, your grocery delivery website, people log into your website or they use your mobile app, they place an order for groceries, they schedule a delivery time, they check out, someone else goes out to shop for that order, and when they're done, they bring that order to the door. So that's our framework. You may be familiar with companies that do this. You are a research-minded person here, and right now, your company does not allow anyone to add items to an order once it's been checked out, even if that order is hours or days in advance from now. Your product manager has a pretty good idea of what they want to do. They say, you know what, on the review order screen, we're just going to give people a little search box. They can type something in, they can find that item, and they can add it to the order. Designer mocks it up, it looks good, they can go and talk to the engineer, and the engineer says, this probably can work, but I think we're missing something. What if people are not at the review order screen and don't know that they can go there? We should probably put a way to add an item to the order on the page for every single item. So this is the initial hypothesis here. The product manager says, all we need to do to get people to successfully add items to their order after it's completed is let them go to the review order page. And the engineer, in a wild turn of events, says, no, we need to increase our scope and allow people to do it from every item page. And it's actually at this point that you, the researcher, get called in, and you have most of the work is cut out for you. You've got a clear hypothesis, you've got a clear risk identified, so all you need to do is figure out what do we need to learn and see so that we could mitigate this risk. Because the risk is, if nobody knows to go to the view order page, they won't be able to add items on our website, and they'll still call support. They'll still have to make other orders. There's already a design in place. The product manager and the designer have worked up this little design. So the only thing you need to do is turn it into a clickable wireframe prototype, and then we can watch people use it. There are kind of two things we need to learn here. You realize that you don't know a lot about the scenarios in which they use it. So if you remember our user experience model, where yes, we're talking about the prototype, but there's one layer deeper. It's like why and when might people need to add items to this order? So you make a short test plan, and all it is for each of your sessions. Oh wait, we might be. Yes. What are the scenarios that people are adding to the items to the order? And if we build this feature, does it fulfill their needs in those scenarios? So that's basically the kickoff meeting. You sit down because the engineers pulled you in, you, product manager, engineer, and you say, here's what we got to figure out. We decide that we're going to test the prototype by making it clickable, and we're going to do a short background interview. So that's the structure of each session. Let's see what you do then. Next, you recruit 6 users. So you recruit people who have called your support line or emailed into your support to add items to their order because you know that they are representative and this is a scenario in which they've encountered. For each of them, you do an online interview. You ask them, tell me about the last time that you placed an order and then you had to add something to the cart afterwards. You learn from some of them that they ordered and then immediately they forgot, but in most cases that actually it was like a day later, or they told someone else that they were getting an order, and your user told her husband that she was getting a grocery delivery order coming, and the husband said, oh, can you add paper towels? So what this tells us about the scenario is that most of the time that people try to add items to their cart is not when they're on the review order page. The second thing that you've seen, because then you give them this prototype and you put them on the home page, is that they don't think to go to the view order page. 4 out of the 5 people that you tested with did not go to that page and clicked on the items directly and tried to add an item to their existing order from the item page. It didn't work, they failed, the design didn't work. Okay, that was like a rough crack at that story, but you see all these things, you've top line debriefed after each one, you get your notes, you get your team together, they put something like this together, and you decide, you know what? We need to increase our scope and create an entry point from each item page or it won't really work. So the hypothesis was the design is going to work, fine. The risks were that there were scenarios we weren't accounting for and that it wasn't going to work. You watch people do this thing and you learn both that there are scenarios in which there's a time lag between when they place the order and when they add items, so they're not coming in from the order review page. And you learn that they're going to try to go to the item page and do it anyway. So then your engineer says, haha, I was right. We add the mechanism to add the item to the order from every item page, and that is like a really short research spike. So in that scenario, it's the kind of thing that you don't need real customers for. You could test with anybody who's roughly familiar with online e-commerce checkout. You could use usertesting.com, and you can find some people and give them a clickable prototype and some instructions and do something like this in a day. If you're going to recruit real customers and schedule them for video interviews, it may take 2 or 4 days to get this all started up and really get going. So there's number one. It's like short spike, we have a prototype, we have a thing already, but now we see a risk in whether or not it's going to work. Before we build it, let's watch people use it and understand the context in which they're doing that. That's, okay, short story 1. Oh, short story 2. This one gets a little hairier. And let's start with this. You work at a construction software company that's trying to replace blueprints with iPads. Simple. Great. Everybody loves it, actually. Nobody has to do this anymore. And one of the really, really terrible things about people using blueprints for construction is that they go out of date really fast. And there's a person whose job it is actually to like change the sheets and the paper in these things, and they don't always get it right, and so people build things wrong. That's working. That's actually working great, and this doesn't exist anymore. Almost everybody's on your iPad, but now you want to expand. Your team says, we see an opportunity in the market to do something new. We're going to track submittals, which is a really big problem for our users. Does anyone know what submittals are? Do you want to?
Basically, if the original design was for these black tiles, and somebody says, I want to do gray because of this, you, oh no, you go, submittal, sorry. You want to submit which black tile you're going to use, which may or may not be defined originally.
Yeah, so every item in this building, these black tiles, those little T-bars running between the tiles, the lights, the sprinklers, the chairs, the type of concrete used on the floor, the paint, all these panels, there's a materials data sheet, and the person who's going to build that part of the project has to submit it to the general contractor. The general contractor has to look at it, compare it to the architect's specs, send it up to the architect. The architect has to say, that's totally cool. And then they send it back down to the general contractor, and the general contractor says, great, the architect said that was cool, we can build it now. And then they send it back down to the other guy. So the person in the middle is a general contractor who, for every project that they're building, has to collect the data for every single piece of thing going into that building, submit it up, get approval, and send it back down before they can start building. It's like super time critical. And in this case, let's say that you're a researcher and your project team has recognized that this is a real pain point and you have a loose hypothesis about how you might be able to solve it. You've seen that project managers and project engineers, your primary users, are tracking this stuff in software that looks like it's from 1980, or in most cases, they've also made their own Excel spreadsheet for it. That Excel spreadsheet is not shared with anybody. It's not, it's their source of truth, but it's not the company's source of truth. And so it's pretty clear your product manager says, this is a great opportunity, let's build them a submittals tracker. That's great. Like, we see a problem, we can solve it. The only other problem is that you really don't have any engineering, and your product manager wants to make sure that you feel very good about your design direction before you build this thing. So you think, well, maybe we mock it up, maybe we make some prototypes, and you try that, and you realize that every single time you put a prototype in front of a user, they get caught up because the data's wrong. All of your users are so familiar with the detailed line items of every single piece of construction information that they get distracted because it's not their own project information. It doesn't fit together, it doesn't work. So what do? What do you do? Well, let's see. You have this hypothesis. Is the bird's eye view really solving problems? Is it valuable? What could we build to validate this with real data, and how do we know that it's working? And maybe you say, what if we fake all of it? Or your product manager says that. Somehow, what if we can find a way to get their real data into a fake system, show it to them, and support that system for a few weeks, maybe for a few months? This is the direction that you're going to go. It's what we're looking at here in this example is less about the process of lean testing, and a little bit more about the idea of lean artifact development. What is the thing that we need to be able to build to construct the right test scenario? So you decide that you're going to recruit 5 users for long-term beta development and ask them to send you all of their current materials for a current construction project. They're going to CC you on every related email, and with all that data, your system will magically populate the data. Here's the magic. You and your team each get assigned 1 user, and every time that they CC you because a submittal has been sent or approved or submitted or moved up and down that chain, one of you are doing this work to update a spreadsheet. And your designer has been taking all of those spreadsheets and has 2 tabs. One tab is all of the data that you manually update, and the other tab is this dashboard. This is your design. It's great. It's beautiful. And as far as our users know, a computer is making it happen. So you have a test session with your users, and in this case, you just have them look at the dashboard. because they're so attached to the data, and ask them if it's right, and ask them about their reporting needs, because you find out that they need this data to present to meetings with the owner. And so if the dashboard looks right, and if they'll print this out and take it to their meetings, you know that there's a viable way to address this need, and if they can use it for reports, the data is valid and useful. So what you do, of course, is every other week now, you do a lean spike. You do a little bit of planning, you meet with each of your test set users, and after each week, you consolidate that feedback, you give yourself a week for iteration, and then it looks like this. For 2 months, you are getting every single email that they have, making this spreadsheet, populating it, and finally, in the end, your designer gets something like this. And it's not pretty, but you find out that it actually is something that meets your users' needs. They see it as accurate, they're using it for reporting, and when you tell them that the beta period is about to end, they say, no, please don't do that. This is so much better than everything else we've ever seen. So you take it away, but then your engineer realizes that now you can use this Google spreadsheet as a temporary back-end model for a prototype system, and so she builds a small little system to pipe the Google spreadsheets into a real product interface, and suddenly you have a V1 version of the product built, and then everyone holds up a trophy, because that's what business people do. And obviously there's more to it there, but the idea in story number 2 is that we take this idea of lean, we've already got a bit of a strategic backdrop of what we're trying to build, and we keep building the smallest piece that we need without actually building real code, without putting something in the market for it to fail, so that we can learn from what our users need and validate. At any point in that process, even after the first one, maybe the project gets killed. Maybe you're finding out that they don't use it. They're not looking at it. Doesn't help them in reporting for their weekly meetings. These are all the signals that you're looking for as you go. But the point is, we were able to put something in front of our users that wasn't yet code, that tested our assumptions about how they were going to behave with it, and validated the hypothesis that this bird's eye view dashboard was what they needed to track this whole problem area. Okay, that was story number 2. Oh, thank you, the end.